Welcome back, strangers. On August 29th, 2005, the levees protecting the city of New Orleans experienced over 50 failures when Hurricane Katrina made landfall. Billions of gallons of water flooded the city and surrounding areas. I remember watching the devastation on the news every day after it happened, but I could never fully understand the scale of what happened. More than 800,000 people were displaced from their homes after more than 80% of all structures sustained water damage. When we visited New Orleans on our road trip, you could still see the effects that Hurricane Katrina had on the city. The trip allowed me to finally understand how many people's lives were actually affected by Katrina. Almost 13 years later, you can still see how the city is recovering, but not completely healed. Today, we're going to discuss 4 places that are abandoned in New Orleans, 3 of which are a direct result of Hurricane Katrina. In 2002, Six Flags bought a struggling 140-acre amusement park in New Orleans named Jazzland. They upgraded it with new rides and renamed the park Six Flags New Orleans in 2003. By 2005, Six Flags was planning to upgrade the park further and add a water park, but those plans were put on hold when Six Flags New Orleans closed for Hurricane Katrina. Most of the park was flooded and submerged for over a month in water that reached up to 7 feet deep in some areas. Much of the floodwater contained corrosive salt water that damaged many of the rides beyond repair, effectively making it a total loss. The park was the least profitable of all Six Flags parks in the country, and the damage caused by Katrina was estimated to be over $32 million. Yet, Six Flags only received $11.5 million for the loss from their insurance company, causing the park to not be rebuilt and the land lease returned to the city in 2009. Since then, all redevelopment plans for the property have fallen through. Proposals for the site included multiple amusement parks, an outlet mall named Jazzland, and even plans to build a power plant on the abandoned site. Since the property has been vacant for over a decade, it has been used to film several movies that include Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, Jurassic World, and Deepwater Horizon. Despite this, the park is in very poor condition. Trespassing is strictly prohibited, and the property is patrolled 24 hours a day by the New Orleans Police Department. There are several stories online and YouTube videos of people sneaking into the property successfully, but there are also many posts online about being caught and charged with trespassing. We drove to the entrance of the park and filmed with a drone. It appeared like you could attempt to go in if you wanted to risk trespassing for the thrills of YouTube views. The abandoned park is still like a swampy wildlife reserve. We saw a giant snake while there, and the property is also supposedly home to alligators, wild boars, fire ants, and water moccasins. Visit at your own risk. Before Hurricane Katrina, Charity Hospital was the second oldest and second largest hospital in the history of the United States. It was one of 2 teaching hospitals that were part of the Medical Center of Louisiana at New Orleans and were owned by the Louisiana State University system. It primarily served the poor and needy of New Orleans. The hospital was not evacuated, and Hurricane Katrina left 360 patients and 1,200 staff members trapped inside the old building. Water began pouring into the basement and flooded the generators when the levees broke, leaving the hospital without power. The staff relied on 10 portable diesel generators and a few portable ventilators to care for patients in critical condition. The floodwater reached the emergency room, operating room, and morgue, forcing patients to be moved to a higher floor. The bodies of the dead were moved and stacked in the stairwells. It took 5 days before all patients and staff could be evacuated from Charity. The bathrooms overflowed with waste. It was hot and miserable for all of those trapped inside. Patients were evacuated based on the severity of their conditions. The bodies of the dead were left behind until they could be retrieved later. The hospital didn't have a helipad, so patients had to be evacuated by boat or wade through chest-deep water to a helipad on a roof of a parking garage 2 blocks away. National Guard trucks were eventually able to evacuate the remaining patients and staff. 3 weeks after the events of Hurricane Katrina, the Louisiana governor announced that Charity Hospital would not reopen, despite the effort from the military, FEMA, and volunteers who pumped the remaining floodwater out of the hospital and prepared for it to reopen. Many claim the hospital was fully functional and ready to reopen when the governor ordered the power be shut down at Charity. Hospital police forced all staff and volunteers out of the building and locked the doors to the building, leaving the hospital to sit abandoned for the next 13 years. Today, the hospital remains a ghost of the city's past. The property is guarded and patrolled 24 hours a day by security and police. Securing the building cost the city an estimated $3 million a year. We spoke to a friendly security guard about the property. He told us he evacuated the city right before Katrina hit. His family left behind everything they had in their apartment that they would never return to. He didn't return to New Orleans until a year after living in different cities across the country. That's a similar story for countless people who lived in the city when Katrina hit. The population is still 200,000 less than it was before the levees broke. So many people lost everything and never returned to their old homes. Some parts of Charity look worse than others. Most of the damage appears to be from years of neglect. The abandoned hospital has its own ecosystem of birds, plants, bugs, and rodents that have taken over the former hospital. A $1.2 billion hospital was opened in 2015 to replace Charity Hospital, using the state and federal money collected as a compensation for the storm's damage to the old hospital. Our Airbnb was in the Bywater neighborhood of New Orleans. The first night we stayed there, we went to drink at the bar Redux. We were surprised to see a massive, creepy abandoned building behind the bar. It was the old Edward Herbert Defense Complex, a 1.5 million square foot logistics center that was originally built for the U.S. Army Quartermaster Depot in 1919. At its peak, the complex was used as a naval support activity center that housed 3,900 active duty personnel and 2,700 civilian personnel. It had extensive recreational facilities, over 1,000 parking spaces in its parking garages, and over 1 million square feet of air-conditioned office space. The complex has 3 six-story buildings that tower over the east bank of the Mississippi River and the Bywater neighborhood. The complex was not affected by Hurricane Katrina. In May 2005, the Defense Department chose to close the Naval Support Base, and the Navy moved its headquarters to Virginia and its personnel functions to Tennessee. The base was officially closed in 2011, leaving the complex abandoned, except for small staff of security guards and caretakers. However, they weren't enough to maintain the massive property, and they slowly lost the battle to weeds, graffiti, and neglect. The abandoned buildings were used for training exercises by the U.S. Navy, different SWAT teams, and other federal agencies until the city of New Orleans bought the property in 2013. Since then, the property remains abandoned, and you can pretty much walk right into it. Everyone at Bar Redux said the main thing you must worry about inside are tweakers and crackheads. New Orleans did have a proposal to redevelop the property into a center to manage regional disasters, along with turning the property into a cruise ship terminal with hotels and retail stores. Another plan is to turn the property into an educational and creative film complex, yet nothing yet has come from the property. If you're in the area, check it out and be sure to visit Bar Redux. It's family owned and a great place to spend an evening or two eating and drinking. The Lindy Boggs Medical Center was the hospital for the Mid-City area of New Orleans. It originally opened in the 1920s as Mercy Hospital and later merged with Southern Baptist Hospital. The hospital provided many healthcare services to the area, such as emergency care, critical care, and organ transplantation. Lindy Boggs only had 187 beds for patients and was not evacuated for Hurricane Katrina. There were about 120 patients and their families who were inside when Hurricane Katrina hit the 4-story brick building. The hospital managed to survive, but the floodwaters around the building began to quickly rise when the levees failed. The floodwaters caused over 500 people from the surrounding neighborhoods to swim to the hospital in search of help and shelter. The medical center relied on its own generators for power until they were flooded, leaving the building without lights, elevators, or power for the machines keeping the critically ill patients alive. Water overflowed into the first floor past the basement. Patients had to be carried up the stairwells by hand to escape the rising water. Temperatures in the building reached over 100 degrees without air conditioning or proper airflow circulating the building. The morgue was flooded, and bodies could not be properly removed. Over the next few days, the hospital began running low on medical supplies. The staff risked their lives to travel through the floodwater that was over 5 feet high to the doctor's office next door to get more supplies for their patients. Staff continued to wait for rescue, but it wasn't coming. Staff members took a paddle boat out to a nearby parking garage to retrieve boats stored in the garage that they had ferried back to the hospital. They used the boats to evacuate healthy family members of patients first that could make the treacherous journey without potential medical complications. This got the attention of rescuers who began working on a plan to safely evacuate the sick and dying patients that were trapped inside the hospital. All 13 hospitals in New Orleans were being evacuated, so patients had to be transported to makeshift emergency clinics nearby or to hospitals in other cities. 19 people died in Lindy Boggs Medical Center. An unknown number of people died from being evacuated from the hospital. Today, Lindy Boggs is abandoned after the damage it sustained during Katrina. It is in far worse condition than Charity Hospital. Rainwater collects and sits stagnant on the old entrance of the emergency room. Walls are crumbling inside, and there is hazardous debris everywhere. The site remains untouched because of the high cost to remove the asbestos still inside of the building. There have been numerous plans to redevelop the site, but none have come to fruition. The Mid-City area has been without a critical healthcare center since the hospital closed in 2005. Many residents hope that the site will become a future home of a new hospital with an emergency room to serve the needs of the surrounding community. Strangers, which of these abandoned places would you take a risk to explore? Even if you don't like visiting abandoned places, you should visit New Orleans if you get the chance. You can still see how the city is recovering and growing after the devastation it went through 13 years ago. It's a chance to understand the scale and damage that occurred. In a time of instant new updates, it's easy to become desensitized to tragedies. Next time you see a disaster on the news, consider doing something that might help the victims by donating or volunteering with an organization that is helping those affected. Helping others and being there for each other in a time of crisis is what sets humanity apart. Without helping each other, it's too easy for society to devolve into anarchy during a tragedy. We hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, stay strange.